But very warm welcome to our third Cepinar on the topic of the Fit for 55 package. Today we're going to discuss with our panelists the role of competitive European industry in contributing and reaching climate neutrality in European Union. So on the screen with me, you see Heiko Kunz, who's working for DG Klima. He knows the ETS directive in and out. We have also with us today Judith Curtin-Darling, who's Deputy Secretary General of Industrial, the European Trade Union. And last but certainly not least is Marco Eikelenboom, who's CEO of SAPI Europe. So to give you a little bit of more context to where we are in our conversation, so far from our perspective, in the industry perspective, we see that our contribution reaches far beyond just reaching the just providing economic growth to in European Union, and that goes from making sure that our value chains are sustainable. So we provide meaningful employment for multiple people across the value chain. Then it's also about, in our case, it's also reducing the dependence on fossil fuels, not only when it comes to energy, but certainly when it comes to products. And we do help cutting emissions in other sectors, for example, in nearby plants or district heating. So today I ask our speakers to think a little bit more and share their thoughts and insights about how the policies that we have on table for a little bit less than a year can provide an enabling framework for the industry to not only stay competitive or become even more competitive, but at the same time contribute to climate neutrality. And I will start with Heiko today. So we're still crunching the numbers from the ETS registry, but it seems like we're continuing our path to constantly reduce the emissions. So now it should be around 36% since 2005. So my question to you was around the framework, and what do you see in the Commission's proposal as the elements that are the opportunity for the industry to transform and to better contribute to the decarbonization of Europe?
Yes, well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks a lot for the introduction, for the invitation to this event, Marcosia. On your question, I think the ETS proposal has a number of, I think, relevant elements providing opportunities for industry to decarbonize at the end. That's the ultimate goal. One important one is that we more or less maintain the free location approach as it stands today as a major tool to protect against carbon leakage risks. So we maintain the share of free location, 43% plus buffer. So this has not been changed despite all calls to sell more allowances, because with money you can do many interesting things. And the free location approach has also been revised with the aim to avoid that we have got a haircut to free location to everybody, this famous cross-sectoral correction factor, which in case we overshoot with the demand for free location, the supply, then we need to cut everybody's free location. And the proposal really aims at avoiding this factor or keeping its impact as low as possible. And to achieve this, we have a more focused free location that the still limited number is more or less given to those who have more difficulties in decarbonization, and that translates into this benchmark update rates. But we also develop free location further towards a support mechanism for innovative technologies, because we have today the problem that if you really switch entirely your technology and you do not emit anymore, then you're not covered by the ETS. Fair enough on the one hand side, but of course you could also not benefit from free location. And to open up free location also to innovative non-emitting technologies, we also have some elements like extending the scope of the ETS and revising in a later stage the definition of benchmarks. And last but not least, I think also need to mention the Innovation Fund, also today a major tool to support industry in its transition. And of course, we've seen with the price increase of the allowances that the monetary size, of course, increases in the same manner. But the proposal also foresees to put additional allowances into this fund. And a major source will be the free location we would not need anymore, because we proposed to replace free location partly by the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. So the sectors covered by this new carbon leakage protection tool, they would gradually phase out free location, and the allocation, the allowances go to the Innovation Fund. So that's, I think, an important step, which will also help to contribute to the industrial decarbonization.
Thank you, Heiko. And maybe with this, I will remind our audience that it's possible to ask questions in the chat box. So if you have any questions at any time to one of our speakers, please don't hesitate to share them with us. And then I will move to Judith. So yes, together with Cepi, we're working in a social dialogue, and you're very well aware of how many people our value chain employs, over 4 million in Europe. And I just wanted to ask you more about your thoughts on the conversation in the Council and the Parliament. So would you agree with the statement that the developments that we've seen so far in the discussions are ultimately leading to potentially less competitiveness and also losing jobs along the value chain?
And I don't think that I would, well, I don't think I would support the statement in a black and white sense, as you've put it, but I think that's why you've asked, because I think you want to stimulate the conversation. But obviously, from the perspective of industrial Europe, we represent manufacturing, mining, energy workers right across Europe, and the transition, the twin transition that we're embarked on, but particularly the green transition, is you know, a major challenge for many of our members. Not a challenge without any opportunities, but a significant challenge, and particularly in energy intensive industries like the paper sector, the challenge is really significant to see how we can reach minus 55% by 2030, obviously with the longer term objective of climate neutrality. We've had many conversations inside industrial Europe over the last few years of finding where we stand in this debate, finding our positions. And there is broad consensus amongst trade unions in the industrial sectors that the destination is the right one, climate neutrality by 2050. There is discussion about how, and so it's not a question of if, it's a question of how. And I think it's very clear from also when you see the debates in the European Parliament and the Council that there are natural tensions in this. How do we make radical, deep cuts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, whilst maintaining an industrial fabric in Europe, whilst maintaining employment for the 4 million workers who are more working in forest-based industries, but also the 25 million workers who are across the whole of manufacturing in Europe. I mean, this is colossal industrial revolution. And I think kind of coming to your question of when we talk about industrial competitiveness and international competitiveness and the transition, what we're particularly focused on is how the measures which maintain that industrial fabric in Europe and that employment in Europe. And for us, the leitmotif, if you like, is just transition. And I have to be honest and say that while we've seen an improvement in some of the rhetoric around just transition in the Fit for 55 package, actually in terms of concrete measures of how you manage that colossal industrial revolution, which has major social and employment impacts, we see very, very little in concrete terms in relation to the just transition. We have hard legislation when it comes to emission reduction. We have hard legislation when it comes to benchmarks and standards. And we have soft measures and soft coordination when it comes to this colossal industrial revolution that we're embarking on, which will impact not just the 4 million workers in the forestry-based kind of value chain, but also that wider industrial fabric right across Europe. And what we're talking about, something like 7 million workers in Europe's energy intensive industries. And clearly we're in a different place today than we were when the Fit for 55 package was published in July last year. The context that our members are operating in is extremely volatile. It's very worrying for many. We have, if I take the paper sector, we had our basic materials network last week, where we had reports from different paper pulp workers across Europe, where we have sites which are running below capacity because of the energy costs. We have questions about commodity prices. It's an extremely volatile context, and for us that means it's all the more important that we have a far stronger agenda around just transition. And I'll finish on that because I know we're meant to be short to begin with, but for us the five pillars, which are not mutually exclusive but actually equally important, are we need a far stronger industrial policy for Europe, which really puts industrial policy at the level of climate ambition, with good jobs at the centre and level playing field measures obviously within that. We need adequate resources. The increases in the Innovation Fund, the Modernisation Fund, really welcome for us in the ETS, but we need to be looking at how we can really channel the level of investment, public but also private investment, into the transition. Obviously, just transition for us means strong collective bargaining, social dialogue, negotiating the transition in companies and sectors, and a toolbox of workers' rights, anticipating the change, already preparing. One of the biggest challenges for many of our industries today are skills shortages, with different industries fighting over the same set of workers. So we can't deal with climate, the transformation of our economy in terms of climate, without also looking at these key anticipation policies. And that means also having a far stronger agenda in our view around training, lifelong learning, and skills questions. These for us are the kind of 5 pillars which are really crucial to complete the Fit for 55 package. And without them, and in this currently extremely challenging situation, we fear that they will become the Achilles heel of our climate ambition. So maybe I'll stop there, and I'm happy to continue this conversation. Always good to be in a dialogue with Cepi.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you for making your speech short. We still have Marco to share with us his initial thoughts. And yes, our audience is usually shy, so please remember about putting your questions in the chat box. And I will come back to this idea of talking more about the industrial policies maybe in our Q&A session, Marco. So our industry has been in the ETS system since the very beginning, since 2005. How would you define the main challenges in our industry when it comes to the ETS? And also, how would you see our industry in the conversation on CBAM, on the introduction of this new instrument?
Yeah, thank you, Malgosia, and likewise, always a pleasure to be in these panels and to debate with our colleagues and stakeholders. I think Cepi is maybe a slightly different animal, because we're a very global company. We've got asset manufacturing base in Europe, in South Africa and in North America. And let me start off by saying that particularly from a European legislation perspective, it's not only that we want to be the front runner, but we have to be the front runner, because legislation, as one of my colleagues said, is one of the main export products Europe has. We're setting, and this is positively meant, Heiko. We're setting the tone for the rest of the world, but we also need to be cognizant that you need to have followers to set a certain pace, and Cepi is very much willing to take that role. We're a company that contributes to a thriving world, as stated here behind me, by truly unlocking the power of renewable natural resources. That is the beauty of our industry, and that's why Cepi is doing all this great work in portraying that proposition. And we're very proud of that. We truly want to become a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem. So again, thank you so much for having the opportunity to do so. And I think that the industry have proven that we are a front runner in this aspect. We have 62% currently of our energy mix already comes from sustainable biomass sources. Waste and residues are, as much as we can, being captured and reused for alternative products. We're not, by far, not only talking about pulp, paper, and packaging. We're talking more and more about biomaterials, about all kind of applications, and truly unlocking the potential of trees. That is what our industry stands for. Now, Małgosia, you were asking me about the challenges, which obviously there are. If you want to be a front runner and you have a region, the European region, that is taking the lead in the positive lead in legislation when it comes to climate change and to carbon emission, then from an industry perspective, very much as Judith was talking about the colossal transformation that is required, there's one thing that remains very, very important, and that is that the industry keeps its competitive advantage. We cannot deal with all the legislation, all the regulations coming at us, losing our competitive edge and losing the game to other world regions where maybe this legislation is less strict. So the European pulp and paper industry is a big one. It represents over 20% of European industry output. As said, we've been a front runner, and Małgosia, you said it as well, since the beginning of the EU ETS system. We have reduced emissions by 36%. That is from 2025 onwards. So we're on a track to comply with many of the ambitions that we have, but it is important that we remain competitive to keep creating jobs, to keep adding value to the European value system. Therefore, and these discussions add to that, it is very, and Heiko, coming back to the fact that legislation is necessary and that a close relationship to policymakers is crucially important. We need to keep on understanding the overall impact of the legislation. That goes for us, but I think it is as important for the policymakers itself to understand what the implication is for the industry. And if we would be included in CBAM as an industry, we need to have that full assessment. We need to know what this means for the industry. We need to know what it means for the competitive landscape. And right now, as we are gradually replacing the free allocation by a carbon border adjustment mechanism, there are implications, and only a few sectors are probably already ready or can cope with these changes. But it's certainly not a simple and easy way of making the transformation. And lastly, Małgosia, as a true challenge, we need to stay triggered or incentivized as an industry to keep on investing towards the ambitions by 2030. It cannot be that by just steamrolling the legislations over European industry that you lose this followership. The industry has a certain ambition that needs to go parallel with the Commission's ambition, and I think we've proven that we can do that as long as we stay competitive. The complexity will not kill us in that ambition, and ultimately it needs to be predictable and as simple as possible to implement. We don't win anything if the operation is successful, but the patient is about to die, and therefore. What I've said in previous seminars as well, there needs to be a certain empowering mechanism that stimulates innovation in this industry. We are a highly innovative industry. We want to invest in this transition, but please give us the means and the horizon to do so. Innovation is phenomenal. It's crucially important to this industry, but it cannot happen overnight. We need a certain time. And I know that the statement is easily made, well, the harder you push, the harder they run. But we need to stay realistic. And I think with that, Małgosia, I'd like to finish off my brief.
Thank you, Marco. And I know that I can count on you to already trigger some conversation between the panelists. So going back to this idea of where the legislation is going. Obviously, before the event, I sent around a speaker briefing, and when I sent it around, I was not aware of what would happen in the Parliament last week. However, I think that the question still remains relevant. What were this one thing that you would single out as something that really struck you in a positive or negative way? And I will start with Heiko, because the proposal is out of the Commission's hands, and now we're about to adopt the mandates for negotiations.
Yes, indeed, it's out of our hands, but I think that's really valid in terms of substance, but also in terms of process. I think many people were really taken by surprise that the Parliament was not able to adopt its position, but of course we hope that this will be done very soon, hopefully next week, but I think that's to be confirmed. I think there are a lot of talks ongoing in the Parliament, and I think it would be indeed very important that they come up with their mind very early, that the negotiations can start. Many interesting amendments, for example, on the overall ambition that the delivery of the ETS should be higher than proposed. But maybe let me focus on one I was very surprised to see. And that's an amendment which has been tabled in plenary, so more or less at last moment, without many discussions so far. And it looks very technical. It's about updating benchmarks. Because as I mentioned, we intend to open up benchmark definitions to include more innovative technologies. And there is one proposal to exclude basically the most innovative installations from the benchmark setting. So it looks very technical, but it's important in terms of quantities and in terms of distributional effects within industry, because this amendment will only benefit one sector, the steel sector, and to an extent of 20 million allowances per year. And that's the equivalent of 4% points of the cross-sector correction factor. So as this amendment passed in the first plenary vote, it could happen again, but then I think industry as such should be mindful of the consequences for everybody. That's something I found really striking.
Thank you, Heiko. And if I can use my power as a moderator, what did you think about the proposals on conditionality?
They are interesting. They go beyond what the Commission proposed. I think the beauty of, if I may say that, what we proposed was that it's quite easy to implement from the administrative point of view. We rely on existing tools, the energy audits, which anyway need to be carried out, and their conclusions. So that was for us a very obvious choice to link it to that. The Parliament goes further. It's more complex. I mean, the intention is, I think, very similar, to give additional pushes for investments, but it looks a little bit complicated for my taste.
complicated, I think, is the right word. And Judith, the same question to you. What was this one thing that struck you in a positive or a negative way, apart from the outcome of the last week's vote?
Yeah. Well, maybe on the conditionality, that was a positive in a sense from our perspective. The idea that companies should have decarbonisation plans is a key element for us in ensuring this just transition framework. In the original amendment, I think in ENVI, actually they were just transition plans within companies. That was changed to decarbonisation plans. But for us, this is really key in terms of ensuring a framework in which there's a level of strategy building. And obviously we want workers within companies to be part of that strategy building so that it's a really fair transition with everybody involved. You can see our slogan is nothing about us without us. So we need the policy levers within the legislation to achieve that. And we saw that as a positive. I guess the frustrating part of last week was that ultimately the vote came down to 2%, and whether it was or 2 years, sorry, 2 years, not 2%, whether it was 2032 or 2034 for the phase out of free allocations, and we were a bit frustrated that it wasn't possible for a compromise to be agreed within the plenary around that, because it seems, in terms of climate, our view is that the climate emergency will still be addressed if it was a date of 2034, and equally 2032 we're quite kind of sanguine, I would say, or in some cases skeptical about some of the claims from some of the industries in which our members work about the point where everything collapses and it's an industrial catastrophe. And this is an example where actually some level-headed negotiation to find a decent compromise, we feel would have, it would have been possible. So it was frustrating that the whole of the pack, the three pieces of the puzzle, the ETS revision, the CBAM, which is very important for us, but also the Social Climate Fund, which is an absolutely crucial instrument for people who are suffering from energy poverty and mobility poverty across Europe, that this was all brought down on the basis of this difference of 2 years. So that was kind of frustrating in the vote, if we're honest. And we hope that before the next plenary, an agreement can be made, which is realistic. We're concerned that some of the rhetoric is done for political objectives, but not really based on the feasibility of the pathway for specific industries. There are lots of assumptions about what will be needed to decarbonize some energy intensive industries, but we don't yet have clean hydrogen in large amounts. We don't have abundant, affordable, renewable energies in adequate amounts. We don't have CCUS at the scale that would be needed for certain energy intensive industries. So we were a little bit frustrated that people seem to be very tied to a specific date rather than kind of trying to find some of the compromises needed to tackle these much bigger questions.
Thank you, Judith. And if I were to pick up one word from your answer, it would be frustrated, I guess. And also it goes back to what you said at the very beginning, that it's not, we're not really questioning the direction of going, and most of the tools are already more or less defined. So it was frustrated to see the result of the conversation on Wednesday. And yes, Marco, the same question to you. Anything positive, negative that you take out from the conversation in the Parliament?
Well, I think the positive element is certainly the debate that continues on how to realize our ambitions as quick as possible under the best circumstances. I'll already give you my 2 words, and that is competitiveness and complexity, the 2 C words, because that is of the biggest concern. And what struck me was certainly that apparently, and from the outside, there is a view that policymakers have chosen to make the ETS even more expensive for the industry to achieve similar or same climate ambitions, and that is an increased emission reduction by 2030. We strongly have the feeling that that it is becoming that the bill is once again being pushed over to the industry, and that this will make us having to pay a higher bill than what was initially anticipated. The change from a free allocation are, as we see it, and as Cepi feels it, to the disadvantage of early movers who already invested in reducing their emissions. So it is, I wouldn't immediately call it changing the goalposts, because I think we all have similar ambitions to get as quickly as possible to the ambitions that we've set. But again, it comes to the point that this needs to be done under a competitive framework where the industry needs to be allowed to do what it's able to do, keeping its competitive advantage towards the rest of the world. And again, the pulp and paper industry is big enough to make that a concrete call out, but also the complexity truly needs to be looked at, because by adding another layer of complexity, and again, that is the way we view it as an industry, and it might be slightly one-sided, but we see that complexity is added once again, and I think the signals that we give to the outside world, everybody who's reading about it in newspapers, that we would like to go for a market-based mechanism that is designed to enhance cost efficiency, that message has the risk of being slightly blurred.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you for anticipating already the words that best describe your input to this question. There is already one question in the chat box, and I think that it's, well, Heiko, maybe you already saw it. It's about how the different policies that we're seeing being developed, they're aligned, and they make sure that once we step up our game in one place, so that it's also aligned in another place. So it's the question about this strategic autonomy when it comes to material sourcing and manufacturing, and the climate ambition. And I think that it also touches a little bit on what Judith said about the overall industrial policy and the framework that we have for the competitive business. So Heiko, how do you see this alignment between making sure that we have the autonomy that we need, not only on energy, but also on raw materials, and at the same time, we make sure that the climate policy remains flexible to a certain extent to make sure that they are aligned?
Yes, well, that's of course not an easy one. I mean, a priori, it really looks like a contradiction, reducing emissions in the EU, and at the same time building up new capacities for raw material extraction and manufacturing. And I mean, the same goes also when we cut off certain energy supplies, which are less carbon intensive than possible replacements. So that is something which in the short run, of course, causes problems and contradictions. But on the other hand, it's the full picture which needs to be seen, and climate policy is a very important one, but not the only one to be considered. So there are other aspects. And I think it's more important strategically to look a bit further into the future. And then if you decarbonize industry, it is possible to do both, to bring in more production facilities in the EU, if they are really using low carbon technologies, they do not contribute to emissions. So once we are there, that we do have low carbon technologies really working on the ground, then I think we can manage this contradiction. And that should be, yeah, it should be maybe also used as a push that we top up our efforts to decarbonize, because it also helps in the long run or mid and long term to become more independent from raw material and energy supplies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Heiko. And Judith, you mentioned this industrial policy and one of the enabling frameworks for not leaving anyone behind and making sure that the industry can flourish in Europe. And how would you see that happening in practice? Because so far we've seen industrial policies having a different update cycle than the policies to which the industry needs to comply. Do you have any solutions there?
Well, I think one of the positive elements of the renewed or updated industrial strategy is the development of transition pathways and the development of an industrial policy strategy toward bringing together the different policies in a kind of coherent pathway framework, so that it's clear what the challenges are, what we're trying to achieve, and then you can kind of lock in the different tools along the way. Our slight concern is that that it's those tools which are still relatively weak at European level. And if we think about what the transition means across Europe, the transition will happen locally in different parts of Europe, and the industrial policy framework, which is a key enabling part of making sure that the transition is fair, but also making sure that we don't increase regional inequalities in the future through this process. Those tools are still, in our view, kind of underdeveloped. So we have the development in certain areas, key strategic areas of things like industrial alliances, important projects of common European interest, but the scale and the pace of the rollout needed for breakthrough technologies means that we think that kind of needs to be far more coordinated at European level, and we, you know, there are certain things in different sectors. The combination of the technologies is different. The combination of the tools is different, but we need to have an agenda. And in fact, that's one of the things that we've also been working with you guys on, around the coherence between things like the European forestry strategy and our agenda around Fit for 55, and around a strong, sustainable forest-based industry, as well as the other benefits of forestry. So that's one example where you need to really take a sectoral view or an ecosystem view, but looking at the impacts of various policies on each other to avoid that we end up with policy contradictions. And I think that's the same when we come to the development of raw material strategies more generally. And obviously we represent mining workers across Europe, as well as the secondary raw materials sectors, in the metal sectors and the chemical sectors, and so on. And it's clear that there are various impacts of different European policies, which sometimes can be a little bit perverse when on each other. And so this idea of coherent transition pathway for ecosystems is very good in theory, but I don't think we've really got it sussed completely at European level in terms of the various policy areas. And part of it is, you know, that classic classic problem of policy silos. The different parts of the Commission are responsible for different policy areas, and the communication is improved in some areas, but not right across the board. So there's a need for really a clearer plan in that sense, and then you bring the funding, the resources alongside it to ensure that the various public funding streams and investment financing streams are there, but locking in private finance into the transition as well, which is where, for maybe it's controversial, but for us the conditionality aspects are extremely important to make sure that when public funds, if you like, are used as state aid or as free allocations or other sources, that actually that is directly tied to investment in jobs, in the decarbonisation of installations in Europe, and that that's not just a blank check to industry. And I think that's extremely important in this transformation for public acceptance of the transformation as well. So these are, when we talk about industrial policy, we're talking about around the full range, and obviously with the level playing field, CBAM has an important place to play in that. But I guess this comes back to the previous comment, the previous question about the votes in the European Parliament. CBAM is a new instrument. It will be very important in the future, but with all new instruments, you need to be able to test and to ensure that it delivers the objectives that it set out for, and that's that we're a little bit concerned that this rapid phase out of free allocations, rapid introduction of CBAM actually creates more uncertainty and threatens investment if we're not careful. So it's about having that joined up picture. That's how we interpret industrial policy. With the obviously the objective of climate neutrality by 2050 and transformation of our industries.
Thank you, Judith. And yes, on conditionality, we do have opposite opinions on this one, but I guess we're all very well aware of that. With the conditionality, we felt that it's really going towards not looking at the big picture of carbon leakage and actually what the positive impact the industry in Europe has, but it goes more into direction of micromanagement. But I mean, Judith talked a lot about this living in the industry, living in this constant tractions between different policies. And I think that, Heiko, also the initial question to you was about that. So, Marco, what would make it your life easier when it comes to those not always aligned objectives? So both are good, because when it comes to material autonomy, this is an objective that that no one can argue with, but at the same time having the policies that step up the climate ambition.
I think, Małgosia, two things would help, and I know I'm asking for slightly, I wouldn't call it impossibilities, but I know how difficult it is. But predictability is certainly one thing. We're operating already in an environment that is, let alone the regulatory framework that we need to operate in, that has an incredible amount of uncertainty, and all industries, all companies are trying to deal with that basically on a day-by-day basis. We thought we had seen it all after COVID, but there's one unthinkable event after the other, with the latest disaster, of course, taking place in Ukraine. But that level of uncertainty, of course, doesn't help us to stimulate an appetite for change, because the environment is already so unstable. So if I could ask of one thing, it is this predictability, because with predictability comes time as well, and being very plannable around these huge ambitions is, I think, a condition that all the industries need to have. You need to have a certain confidence that by 2030 you are able to develop the plans that reach these very high ambitions in terms of our decarbonization strategy, whether it comes from the European Commission or from ourselves, because we're certainly not alone. But Cepi has adopted science-based targets. We're very clear on that. We're very transparent on that. Also because we want to give a certain predictability to our stakeholders, be it customers, be it shareholders, be it investors, the communities that we operate in. They need to know what we're up to, and they also need to know, in the worst case scenario, when we do not have enough time or resources or money to cope with the high ambitions that are being set by the European Commission. And again, I reiterate the point that Judith is making. It is not that industries or companies are opposed to these kind of measures. We're all grown up enough to understand that things need to change. And I love your just transition statement, Judith. It is about there's hardly any way back thinkable, but it needs to be affordable and it needs to be plannable in that sense. So you asked me for one thing, Małgosia, it's predictability.
Thank you, Marco. And actually, we thought of a question that relates very strongly to predictability, because when we saw the proposals last year coming out, it is true. We didn't think that what happened is actually possible to happen. So my question to Heiko is, to what extent you feel that the Commission proposals are still up to date when it comes to the assumptions on the speed of the transition of the possible speed of the transition of the industry, when it comes to assumption on the ETS price, on the energy prices, energy availability. Do you think that it still holds?
Well, I'm not 100% sure if it fully holds, but the question back will be, what should we do about it? Because, I mean, coming also back to predictability, we don't want to adjust now the ETS proposal whenever there is a new situation coming, a new crisis coming. I think the basic or the starting point is absolutely valid. Even with the war in Ukraine and the increasing energy prices, I think it shows even more that decarbonization must be our long-term strategic objective. Because fossil fuel, you don't burn because you want to reduce CO2 emissions. You don't need to buy somewhere. So I think that goes hand in hand. But obviously, the transition is more difficult maybe than foreseen a year ago. But it was also very similar with COVID, when the Commission or the von der Leyen Commission proposed its Fit for 55 package. It was also not, we couldn't really envisage what will happen then in the next 2-3 years from there. But I'm really very happy about the fact that the objective of climate policies, it stays, it remains, and no one is really putting it in question. And that's really different from the situation when I started dealing with climate policies. It was 2008, 2009. We just adopted the ETS directive for phase 3, and then came Lehman Brothers and really a deep economic crisis, and everything was put in question at that time. The idea to ask more in terms of emission reduction, it was simply out of question. The only reaction we had for those who make climate policies was to more or less maintain what has been achieved, but not developing it further, because it was considered there are other priorities, economic crisis and climate policies are contradictory. That's something I think 10 years later, we really learned to overcome, that things go hand in hand. Of course, many difficulties in the transition, and I think one tool which has been applied for this purpose is making funds available funds for economic recovery, but at the same time also to finance the transition and the investment of industry. And I think that makes a lot of sense to do both things at the same time, obviously also with the same money.
Thank you, Heiko. And yes, that's a good reminder that we also moved on in our approach to how we should talk about the direction of where we're traveling with the decarbonization and CO2 reductions. And Judith, to you, the same question, like, what do you see are the real implications of the conversation on Fit for 55 following the ongoing war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, for us, the very clear conclusion, which has been reiterated by trade union leaders across Europe, is that the current context is extremely volatile. Let's, in every sense, in some ways. I mean, the volatility is something that we're all having to get used to, and that makes the need for a stronger social dimension to the whole package all the more important in our view, because the social impacts of, on the one hand, the transformation, so the colossal need for upskilling and reskilling of the workforce across Europe, the need in terms of transition planning, the introduction of new technologies, the transformation of workplaces. All of this needs to be anticipated and managed in a socially fair way. But in the context of the war in Ukraine, and with the high energy prices and raw material prices, obviously we're confronted by a situation in which the resources left for that social management of change are really squeezed. I mean, if I think about the discussion that we had with paper and pulp workers last week, we had a collective agreement in Austria, for example, at the end of last year, which was considered to be a groundbreakingly good pay award and a very good collective agreement. But with the pace of inflation, now workers face real wage reductions because of the impact, and at the same time, workplaces are furloughed, or some workplaces are operating only in off-peak times because of the energy prices. So you have the need for a far stronger social dimension to the whole package to avoid our biggest concern, which is that there will actually be a backlash to the direction of travel because people are so squeezed. Is for us, that's the part which is really missing from lots of the policy conversation at European level at the moment. We see the rationale of REPowerEU, of powering up renewables, powering up clean hydrogen, getting a far quicker path to the energy transition. That's something that we support. And is clearly about delivering a longer term sustainable framework for industry in Europe, also about creating jobs if it's done well in European value chains. But the challenge for us is really the social management of change at the moment, and avoiding that there is a social backlash because of the enormous multitude of changes which are touching on ordinary people. And there are some things that we could think about. I mean, the revolution in COVID and in the pandemic was really the creation of things like the SURE program at European level, which created support for temporary unemployment across Europe for workers impacted by the pandemic. There's a question, why could we create a similar kind of program in the context of high energy prices to allow the upskilling and retraining of workers in periods of lower production, so that we're kind of anticipating the needs for the future in terms of climate, and putting on the table some signals to working people that the pain is understood within this package. Those are some of the ideas that we've included within our Just Transition manifesto, which we published in the middle of May. But this for us is now becoming extremely critical. You only have to look at the results of the French presidential election and seeing that the majority of young people, the majority of blue collar workers voted for the extreme right. I don't think that's because they supported Le Pen's views in terms of racism or migration, but I think she tapped into that cost of living crisis, which is corrosive to the overall transition that we need to be seeing. So we need European institutions to realise the scale of the challenge that our members, that working people across Europe are facing, and by extension also the industries are facing. In order that we maintain this broad consensus that the direction of travel is climate neutrality, because we all know the UNFCCC, the IPCC reports, the climate emergency hasn't stopped because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We know where we need to get to, and now we need to double down on the efforts to get there in a socially fair manner.
Thank you, Judith. And the teams just reminded me that we have 5 minutes left. In fact, it's 4 minutes left. So I wanted to have the very last question to each of you. And it's connected to the words that we used so far. So we talked about volatility, predictability, complexity, simplicity, being surprised, in a positive or negative way. So Marco, if you think about the ETS and the reform of the ETS, if you think about climate neutrality and the role of our sector, by the end of this negotiations, what words you would like to use? Like, what would make you feel satisfied about the result?
Yeah, it comes back, Małgosia, to the earlier statements I made. A level playing field is absolutely necessary. We shouldn't, as Judith said, leave people behind, and it goes for all the stakeholders, including our industry. We need to have the feeling that we are fairly treated, and that it is not about. And I think we're long past that belief. It's not that people do not see the need or the urgency for the change to be made, but it's the affordability, it's the predictability, and it's ultimately the maintaining the competitive advantage that we've fought for so long. If you put it on a global scale, and that cannot be taken away by these very, very important measures that are implemented. And the last thing maybe is the room for innovation. Let's not kill innovation because it's requested to be there tomorrow or next week. Let's give innovation enough room to be nurtured and to have the ability to breed new ideas. That would be my wish list.
Thank you, Marco. I heard you loud and clear. And then Heiko, what would be the words that you would like to describe the ETS revision after it's done for this time?
Yeah, well, maybe to look a bit broader, the ETS revision, I think it's part of a package of 14 measures, so it depends on how you count. I think coherence would be very good, that we see also coherence of the entire package, because we discussed the ETS, but we have also the Social Climate Fund. We do have CBAM, we also mentioned, but also in the energy acquis where we have changes. I think it's really a challenge. It was a challenge to make this package proposal, but I think even more for the other institutions negotiating it. I think it's very important to keep all the different bits and pieces together. And if it's overall coherent, I personally would be more than satisfied.
Thank you, Heiko. Judith?
Well, I don't think it's going to come as any surprise. We'd like to see just transition through that coherence. One part of the coherence is that the rhetoric of not leaving anybody or any region behind is actually put into the substance of the policy framework. And I agree with you, Marco. That's also about maintaining our industrial fabric. in Europe, and that's good quality jobs in transformative industries that are investing in being the front leaders and the front runners globally.
Thank you, Judith. And I couldn't summarize our conversation better, because basically across the line, we do agree that competitive European industry is essential, not only for the economy, but also for people like you and me using the sustainable products, and also in a wider context of reaching climate neutrality. So with that, I really wanted to thank our speakers and our audience for asking the questions. You're going to hear from us most probably, because the conversation on the Fit for 55 package and on the ETS hasn't stopped yet. It's just almost an end of one of the phases on our way there. So thank you so much. Have a good afternoon, and hopefully see you soon.